Mom, day 14. I can't feel my feet anymore. My buddy Joe died this morning. We had to leave him on the road. If I die, know that I fought to the very end. These desperate words were scrawled in blood-stained ink by 22-year-old infantry soldier Tommy Rodriguez from El Paso, Texas, as he stumbled through the scorching Philippine heat in April 1942. His hands trembled not just from exhaustion, but from the horrifying realization that he was walking his own death march. Every step was torture, every breath a miracle, as 76,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were forced on a 120-kilometer journey through hell that would become known as the Bataan Death March. Tommy's diary was discovered 53 years later, hidden inside a rusted ammunition box buried beneath the roots of an ancient mango tree near Mariveles. His nephew, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, was stationed at Clark Air Base in 1995 when a Filipino farmer approached him with a metal detector find that would change everything. The leather-bound journal was water-damaged, pages stuck together with decades of moisture. But Tommy's final words were still legible, written in pencil that had faded to gray shadows across yellow pages that cracked at the touch. If you're fascinated by these forgotten stories of American courage and sacrifice that history books often overlook, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because we're uncovering the most heartbreaking testimonies from World War II that deserve to be remembered. The diary began on April 9, 1942. The day Bataan Peninsula fell to the Japanese Imperial Army. Tommy had been fighting in the Philippine jungles for 4 months, surviving on half rations, battling malaria, and watching his unit slowly disintegrate under relentless enemy pressure. What he didn't know as he raised his hands in surrender was that his real ordeal was just beginning. The Japanese had captured the largest number of American prisoners in military history, but they had no plan, no supplies, and no mercy for the defeated soldiers who now stood before them in the merciless tropical sun. Tommy Rodriguez had enlisted in the army just 18 months earlier, a bright-eyed kid from El Paso who wanted to serve his country and see the world. He'd been assigned to the 31st Infantry Regiment, stationed at Fort Stotsenburg in the Philippines, where American forces had been preparing for the inevitable Japanese attack since tensions began escalating in late 1941. His letters home had been optimistic, full of descriptions of exotic foods, tropical weather, and the camaraderie of military life. His mother, Elena Rodriguez, kept every single letter, treasuring her son's words about learning to speak Tagalog and his friendship with local Filipino soldiers who fought alongside the Americans. But by December 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was followed immediately by devastating airstrikes on Philippine airfields, destroying most American aircraft on the ground and leaving the islands virtually defenseless. Tommy's diary entries from those early days of war showed a young man trying to maintain optimism while watching his world collapse around him. He wrote about the retreat to Bataan Peninsula, about leaving behind comfortable barracks for hastily dug foxholes in the jungle, about watching American and Filipino forces merge into a desperate defensive line against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources and ruthless determination. The siege of Bataan lasted 4 months, from January to April 1942. During this time, Tommy documented the slow starvation of an entire army. Food rations were cut to 1/4 normal portions, then 1/8. Soldiers began eating anything they could find, tree bark, grass, even leather from their boots when desperation set in. Malaria swept through the ranks like wildfire, and medical supplies quickly ran out. Tommy wrote about friends dying not from Japanese bullets, but from diseases that could have been easily treated with proper medicine and nutrition. His handwriting during this period became increasingly shaky, reflecting his own deteriorating physical condition. By early April, the situation had become hopeless. General Edward King, commanding American forces on Bataan, made the agonizing decision to surrender rather than watch his men die of starvation and disease. Tommy's diary entry from April 8th, the night before surrender, revealed a young man who had aged years in just 4 months of war. He wrote about saying goodbye to weapons that had kept him alive, about the shame of defeat, but also about relief that the fighting would finally end. What he couldn't have imagined was that surrender would mark the beginning of an even worse ordeal. Have you ever wondered how American soldiers, trained to never give up, coped with the psychological trauma of surrender and what came next? April 9th, 1942, dawned hot and humid in the Philippine jungle. Tommy Rodriguez stood with thousands of other American and Filipino prisoners as Japanese guards began organizing what they claimed would be a simple march to prisoner of war camps. The Japanese had expected to capture perhaps 25,000 prisoners, but instead found themselves with 76,000 sick, starving, and exhausted men who could barely stand, let alone walk long distances in tropical heat. This miscalculation would prove fatal for thousands. Tommy's first diary entry as a prisoner revealed his initial confusion and misplaced hope. The Japanese guards had provided no information about their destination, the length of the march, or what lay ahead. Some prisoners speculated they would be taken to comfortable camps where they could rest and recover from months of fighting. Others, more pessimistic, wondered if this was simply a more efficient way to execute large numbers of prisoners. Tommy wrote about the eerie silence that fell over the massive group of men as they began walking north along the dusty roads of Bataan Peninsula. The first signs of what was to come appeared within hours. The Japanese guards, many of whom were battle-hardened veterans from campaigns in China, showed no patience for prisoners who couldn't keep pace. When elderly Filipino soldiers began falling behind due to exhaustion, guards would shout orders in Japanese that the prisoners couldn't understand. Those who didn't respond quickly enough faced brutal beatings with rifle butts and bayonets. Tommy watched in horror as men who had fought courageously for months were now being treated like animals by their captors. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. American military training emphasized that prisoners of war should be treated according to the Geneva Convention, with basic human dignity and care for the wounded and sick. Instead, Tommy found himself in a world where weakness meant death, where asking for water could result in a bayonet wound, and where the basic rules of civilized warfare had been abandoned. His diary entries from the first day showed a young man struggling to comprehend the magnitude of cruelty he was witnessing. As the sun reached its peak intensity, the true horror began to unfold. The Japanese had provided no water for the march, despite temperatures soaring above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Prisoners began collapsing from heat exhaustion within the first few miles, their bodies unable to cope with the combination of starvation, disease, and brutal heat. Tommy wrote about watching strong men, soldiers who had survived months of combat, simply crumple to the ground and never get up again. The guards' response was swift and merciless. Anyone who couldn't continue walking was either bayoneted on the spot or shot, their bodies left beside the road as a warning to other prisoners. By the third day of the march, Tommy Rodriguez's diary entries became increasingly desperate and fragmented. His handwriting, once neat and precise, had devolved into barely legible scrawls as dehydration and exhaustion took their toll. He wrote about hallucinations brought on by severe dehydration, seeing mirages of water that weren't there, hearing his mother's voice calling his name from the jungle. But even more disturbing were the very real horrors he witnessed as the Japanese guards' cruelty escalated with each passing mile. Tommy documented atrocities that defied human understanding. He wrote about prisoners being forced to bury their own comrades alive if they were too weak to continue marching. He described Japanese soldiers using bayonets to kill prisoners for entertainment, making bets on how long a wounded man could survive before death. Most horrifying of all, he recorded instances of cannibalism among the guards, who would force starving prisoners to watch them eat rice and meat while denying the Americans even water. The diary entries from days 4 through 7 showed Tommy struggling to maintain his sanity as the march continued. He wrote about a young soldier from California, barely 18 years old, who had been shot in the leg but was forced to keep walking. Tommy and several other prisoners took turns supporting the wounded boy. But as the days wore on, his condition worsened. The smell of gangrene filled the air around their small group, and they all knew the boy was dying slowly and painfully. When Japanese guards finally noticed the wounded prisoner, they didn't provide medical care. They simply executed him with a single bayonet thrust and ordered the march to continue. Perhaps most psychologically damaging was the complete breakdown of normal human social structures. Tommy wrote about prisoners turning against each other, stealing the few scraps of food that occasionally appeared, fighting over drops of muddy water from roadside ditches. Men who had served together, fought together, and protected each other during the siege of Bataan were now competing for survival in ways that stripped away their humanity. Tommy's diary captured the heartbreak of watching good men become desperate animals, driven by starvation and thirst to betray their closest friends. The Japanese guards seemed to take particular pleasure in psychological torture. They would march prisoners past wells and streams, allowing them to see the water but forbidding them to drink. They would eat meals in front of starving prisoners, deliberately wasting food by throwing it on the ground and grinding it into the dirt with their boots. Some guards would pretend to offer water, raising prisoners' hopes before snatching it away and laughing at their desperation. Tommy wrote about the sound of that laughter, how it echoed in his mind even during the few hours of fitful sleep they were allowed each night. What do you think drives human beings to such extremes of cruelty, and how do you believe you would have responded in Tommy's situation? By day 10 of the march, Tommy Rodriguez had reached what he described in his diary as the place where hope goes to die. His feet were masses of infected blisters and open wounds, his lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and his body weight had dropped by at least 30 pounds since the march began. More devastating than the physical deterioration was the psychological damage. Tommy wrote about losing the ability to cry, even when watching his friends die, and about feeling his personality simply evaporate under the relentless pressure of survival. But it was during this darkest period that Tommy experienced something that would save his life and restore a fragment of his faith in humanity. On the morning of day 11, as the column of prisoners stumbled through a small Filipino village, an elderly woman emerged from her house carrying a clay pot of water. Despite the obvious danger, she began offering drinks to passing prisoners. Japanese guards immediately surrounded her, screaming orders and threatening her with bayonets, but she continued her act of mercy until every drop was gone. Tommy was one of the prisoners who received water from this anonymous Filipino grandmother, and he wrote that the cool liquid on his parched throat felt like a miracle. But more important than the physical relief was the emotional impact of her kindness. Here was a person who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by helping enemy soldiers, yet she chose compassion over safety. Tommy wrote that watching this small act of humanity reminded him that goodness still existed in the world, even in the midst of unimaginable cruelty. This encounter sparked something in Tommy that he thought had died during the march. He began reaching out to help other prisoners when possible, sharing the few resources he had and offering encouragement to men who were on the verge of giving up. He wrote about forming a small group with 5 other Americans, all from different states and backgrounds, but united by their determination to survive together. They developed a system of taking turns supporting the weakest member, sharing any food they managed to scrounge, and rotating who would stay awake to watch for guards during their brief rest periods. Tommy's diary entries from the final days of the march showed a remarkable transformation. While his physical condition continued to deteriorate, his writing became clearer and more purposeful. He began documenting not just the horrors he witnessed, but also acts of kindness and solidarity among the prisoners. He wrote about a soldier from New York who gave up his last piece of hardtack to a sick Filipino prisoner, about a sergeant from Texas who carried a wounded man for 3 miles before collapsing himself, and about prisoners sharing stories and memories to keep each other's spirits alive during the endless walking. The march finally ended on April 21, 1942, after 12 days and 120 kilometers of hell. Of the 76,000 prisoners who began the journey, an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 died along the way, their bodies scattered along the roads of Bataan Peninsula like horrible mile markers of human suffering. Tommy was among the survivors who stumbled into Camp O'Donnell, the Japanese prisoner of war facility that would be their home for the next 3 years. But survival came at an unimaginable cost. Camp O'Donnell was less a prisoner of war facility than a death trap designed with calculated cruelty. Tommy Rodriguez's diary entries from his first weeks in captivity revealed conditions that defied human endurance. The camp was built to hold perhaps 5,000 prisoners, but now contained over 50,000 American and Filipino survivors of the Death March. There were no adequate sanitation facilities, insufficient medical supplies, and barely enough food to keep prisoners alive. Tommy wrote about men dying at a rate of 400 per day during the first months, their bodies stacked like cordwood outside the camp gates. Tommy's survival through 3 years of imprisonment seemed nothing short of miraculous. His diary documented the gradual breakdown of military hierarchy and the emergence of a different kind of brotherhood among the prisoners. Rank became meaningless when everyone was equally powerless, and men found ways to maintain dignity in the most degrading circumstances. Tommy wrote about elaborate mental exercises prisoners used to keep their minds sharp, about secret classes where educated prisoners taught languages, mathematics, and literature to their fellow captives. He described intricate systems of barter and trade that developed around scraps of food, pieces of clothing, and precious items like pencils and paper. The most remarkable aspect of Tommy's prison diary was his documentation of prisoners' efforts to maintain detailed records of Japanese war crimes. Despite the enormous risk, groups of prisoners worked together to create hidden archives of atrocities, testimonies, and evidence that they hoped would someday reach the outside world. Tommy became part of this underground effort, using his increasingly precious diary not just for personal reflection, but as a legal document that might eventually bring justice to war criminals. His later entries showed sophisticated understanding of the importance of precise dates, locations, and descriptions of specific incidents. Tommy's liberation came on January 30th, 1945, when units of the U.S. Army's 6th Infantry Division stormed Camp Cabanatuan, the facility where he had been transferred in 1943. His diary entry from that day was brief but powerful. Just 4 words repeated over and over. We are free. We are free. We are free. But freedom brought its own challenges. Tommy weighed less than 90 pounds, suffered from multiple tropical diseases, and carried psychological scars that would never fully heal. His diary entries from the hospital ship taking him back to America revealed a young man struggling to process 3 years of unimaginable trauma. The final entries in Tommy's diary were written after his return to El Paso, where he found a world that had moved on without him. His mother had aged dramatically during his absence. His high school friends had either died in other theaters of war or built new lives he couldn't relate to, and the country he had fought to defend seemed strangely indifferent to the suffering he had endured. Tommy wrote about the difficulty of explaining his experiences to people who had never faced such extremes of human behavior. He described feeling like a ghost from another world, carrying memories that seemed too horrific to be believed by those who had lived comfortable lives on the home front. Tommy Rodriguez died in 1962 at the age of 42 from complications related to the tropical diseases he had contracted during imprisonment. His diary remained hidden in his mother's house until 1995, when his nephew discovered it and recognized its historical importance. The journal was eventually donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where it serves as one of the most complete first-person accounts of the Bataan Death March and subsequent imprisonment. Tommy's words continue to educate new generations about the costs of war and the importance of bearing witness to both human cruelty and human resilience. Today, Tommy's diary stands as testament to the power of ordinary people to maintain their humanity under extraordinary circumstances. His transformation from a frightened young prisoner to someone who chose compassion over despair, even in the face of systematic brutality, represents perhaps the most important lesson of his story. The diary reminds us that while war can bring out the worst in human nature, it can also reveal reserves of strength, kindness, and moral courage that might otherwise remain hidden. Tommy Rodriguez walked through hell and emerged with his soul intact, leaving behind a record that honors both the dead and the living who shared his journey through one of the darkest chapters in American military history. Did you know that the Bataan Death March remains one of the most documented war crimes in military history? Yet many Americans today have never heard of Tommy Rodriguez and the thousands of soldiers who shared his fate.